Hello and welcome to the channel. This is Funhouse, where we review books, movies, and anything else I feel like talking about. Today we're going to talk about a trilogy that I just finished the last book of, the Broken Earth trilogy, and just going to be my thoughts and reflections on that trilogy. Overall, I really liked this series. I think it lived up to its reputation. I think it was very strong as a kind of combination fantasy sci-fi dystopia series. It's a little hard to classify exactly what this series is. It doesn't fit neatly into any category. It's also a little bit literary fiction. It does some really cool things that are really fun to see and experience with the prose. So I'm going to kind of break this down into a couple sections. We're going to talk about the ideas of the book. We're going to talk about the characters of the book. We're going to talk about kind of some of the more technical sci-fi fantasy elements and how they work, didn't work, and then the prose. And I'll finish with I'll mostly be positive this review, but I'll finish with a couple criticisms of the series that keep it from being at the very tip top of my rankings. But this is overall a great trilogy that is among the all time classics and absolutely has earned its place in the pantheon. So, Broken Earth is a series, 3 books. The fifth season, The Obelisk Gate, and The Stone Sky. And the 3 books sort of follow these characters that are living through an apocalyptic event. They live in this broken world where these apocalyptic events happen over and over and over again. And, these communities decide to build themselves up in order to survive these apocalypse level events in between the fifth seasons, if you will. The apocalypse, so that the apocalypses that hit they call them communes. I'm trying to remember, comms, I think, which I think is short for communes, is the settlements. And so they live in these sort of gaps between these big apocalypses. But then when a fifth season hits, they have to leave the comms and try to survive in the ruins of civilization. And each one of these fifth seasons have their own set of challenges. It could be poison gas, it could be earthquakes, but the Earth itself is sort of rejecting the people who live on this planet. So that's sort of the high level picture of this series. A couple of things that were really striking about this series. On a prose level, a lot of the story, but not all of the story, is told in second person. And that's a really bold choice. You almost never see a second person book. And that you find out why, as the series goes on, why it's told in second person. And by the way, just so everybody knows, this is going to be a spoiler-filled review. So if you haven't read these books, go and read them, and then we can come back. This is going to be like a full spoiler discussion of the books. So towards the end of the series, and spoilers for all 3 books, towards the end of the series, you find out that the story is being told to the main character by another character that we meet in the story. And in that character's chapters, we actually switch to first person. And then when we're talking about characters that aren't the quote unquote main character, because there's a couple arguably important, similarly important level characters. But when you're in the second person view, what you're actually hearing is the narrator talking to the main character, explaining her life to her after she's sort of reborn at the very, very end of the series. And you find this out towards the very end of the series, like why we're in second person. The author also does a really cool narrative trick in the first book where you're following 3 different, quote unquote, different characters that one's in second person, and it's been a while since I read the first book. I can't remember if the other 2 are in second or third. I think they're in third person. But as the book comes to a point, you find out that they're actually the same character at different stages in her life, and the 3 stories sort of interweave, and you're like, oh, we're actually following the same person who used different names at different stages of her life because she was undercover or she was in different settings. And that was really cool. It was a really awesome reveal, like, sort of mind-blowing that these 3 characters you've been following for a whole book are actually the same person. Almost like a reverse Fight Club. Or not even a reverse Fight Club, just a Fight Club scenario. So that was really cool. As far as ideas this trilogy grapples with, the big thing that they're grappling with is discrimination. And this book is written from the perspective of characters who are orogenies but are called by a slur word I'm not even going to repeat here because I think it's intended to be a slur and I don't want to repeat even a fictional slur on the channel. Um, the Erogenes are people who can harness the Earth's energy, and I'm a little fuzzy on the science of exactly how that works, which is something I'll talk about a little bit later. But basically, they're able to harness the Earth's energy in order to do crazy things, like magical, almost magical things. And there's sort of two forms of like powers in this world. There's erogeny, and then there's what they just call magic, which is like a magical force that I don't really fully understand what the difference between erogeny and magic is. It was we'll talk about that more in the sci-fi fantasy elements, but I was a little unclear on that. But because these characters are able to harness the power of the Earth, and people live in this dystopian society where the Earth is often trying to kill them, Erogenes are viewed as, and I could be completely mispronouncing this. It could be Oragons. I'm not sure, but I'm going to say Erogenes because that's how I said it in my mind when I was reading the books. They are viewed as dangerous and people that the quote unquote regular folks don't want around. The people who can't harness this power, they don't like the Erogenes because they're dangerous. They can accidentally kill people. They can intentionally kill people. They can turn people into stone. They can cause earthquakes that will destroy an entire city, and so they're very frightening to the regular people. But from their perspective, they feel like they're being discriminated against, and they are being discriminated against basically because of who they are and like what their inherent abilities are. And so this book really dives into the themes of discrimination and what it feels like to be discriminated against, and the types of emotional and thought patterns that emerge from that, and then the coping mechanisms that somebody who is an out group has to develop in order to survive with the in group, whether it be masking their identity, hiding their identity, showing value, showing outsized value to make it impossible to be to be excluded from society. There's all sorts of things, and this book opens on a really sad note where the main character's, whose name is Essen's husband, kills her son because he realizes that the son is an erogeny, like a young child, and beats a young child to death. And that's like the note we start the series on, like the level of discrimination in this society. And it's really bleak from that perspective, but it's also a really compelling view into what it's like to be an out group and what it's like to face that type of societal discrimination where your very life is at risk if people find out who you are. And from that perspective, this series is I don't want to say unique, but it handles these themes in a way with a sensitivity that I've rarely seen. Another big theme that the books deal with is community, and how communities are built and how communities are formed in the face of adversity. So these comms are kind of built in between these fifth seasons, and then people end up on the road, and then they're building smaller comms throughout. And like the second book in particular really dives into this particular comm that the main character finds herself at, that is built in the underground in the face of this fifth season trying to survive. And it also has a lot of Erogenes in this comm. And it really dives into like, how do you build a civilization, a community in the face of adversity and between people that are naturally suspicious and hostile towards each other. And I think that was a really cool theme running through the series, and especially in the second book they dive into the theme of community and building a community and creating communities from scratch, and that was all really cool as well. The final big idea is just survival in the face of devastating trauma and tragedy. Like, there's earthquakes, there's volcanoes, there's all sorts of things happening. The crops are failing, people are starving, there's deserts. Like, the landscape that these people have to survive against is very difficult. And then also there's the survival in the face of discrimination. If you're part of the out group that will be killed by people if they find out who you are, that's also a very dangerous form of surviving. How do you survive in a society that's hostile to your very identity? So this these books really deal with themes of surviving against the elements, surviving against a dystopian landscape, surviving against natural disaster, but also surviving against human created disaster, which is, discrimination and prejudice. So that's sort of the big ideas that the books are dealing with, from a cultural standpoint and a thematic standpoint. I want to talk about the characters a little bit as well. Essen is our main character. She goes by different names in the first book, but she ultimately, through the main thrust of the story, is known as Essen. She's a mother. She's lost children. She's lived multiple lives. She was sort of found when she was young by a guy named Shaffa, who we'll talk about in a second, and became one of the most powerful Orogenies in the world, and was sort of raised by this group called the Guardians that were sort of trying to harness the power of Orogenies, but also protect them. It's a little weird, and it's been a while since I've read the books that really dove into what the Guardians were. But basically they control the Orogenies, supposedly to protect the Orogenies from the rest of society, but also in a very controlling, demanding way that's not good for them. And Essen then leaves that society, and sort of goes rogue and has to go into hiding. And that's when she takes on the name Essen and sort of forms her own life, which blows up on her when her husband in her new life discovers that her son has orogeny powers, and kills her son, and then runs away with her daughter, and then she has to sort of chase her daughter down and her husband and try to reconnect. She's a very tragic character. But also a very powerful character. She's very strong in the face of adversity. She's good at surviving. She's good at making connections with people against all odds. And she's really driven through these books by a sense of wanting to find her daughter, and then as the books go on, realizing that there's been this very stark disconnect from her daughter because of the events that have happened that make it impossible to reconcile with her daughter. And it's a very tragic story with a very tragic arc, and it's so well handled, and she's such a strong, interesting character. It's really well done, and she's a great lens through which to see this world and its horrors. So another key character in the series is Nassin, who is the daughter of Essen, and Nassin goes off by herself, with her father, whose name I believe is Gigi. I don't have that name in front of me right now, but that's my memory of the father's name. And Nassin is a strong-willed young girl. I can't remember how young she is, but I think she's quite young in the series. And she goes off with her father, and then eventually becomes sort of a ward of Shaffa, who we'll talk about in a second. Shaffa was a former mentor to Essen, but was a much more abusive mentor to Essen than he turns out to be to Nassin. And Shaffa's this very complicated character who's really interesting as well. And Nassin is sort of buffeted by the forces of discrimination in the world, and eventually her father, who killed her brother, is trying not to kill her, trying to fight his prejudice against her. But in the second book it comes to a head, and she's forced to kill her father in self-defense because her father wants to come kill her for practicing orogeny. And that's very tragic. And then in the third book, Nassin gets put on this, I don't want to call it a villain arc, but it's a dark arc where she decides that the way that she wants to destroy the world in order to get back at it for all of the discrimination, and basically to end the discrimination and hatred in the world. She sees the only way to do that is by destroying it, which is a pretty, I don't want to call it a villainous arc because it's so understandable where she's coming from, because she's coming from this place of great trauma and the way she's been treated over and over again by the people in her life. But the end result is that she wants to destroy the world. So it's a really sad arc, because you come to really care about this character, and then she gets overwhelmed by these dark emotions, and sets herself on a path that's very destructive. but it's a very understandable destructive path. You're like with her every step of the way. You're like, yeah, that makes sense from your perspective, from what's happened to you. Like, I totally get, like why you want to lash out at this world that has done nothing but hurt you and hurt the people you care about. So Shafa's an interesting character as well. He's a guardian who ends up entangled in both Essen and Nassen's life and sort of controls them and tries to keep them on a path where they don't destroy the world, but then later changes his mind and becomes, when he's with Essen, and this is from the earlier books, but I've read it quite a while ago, so I'm a little fuzzier, but on exactly how their relationship went. But like essentially, he was pretty abusive to Essen, and was a very like dark mentor. Somebody who was willing to kill his prodigy if they stepped out of line. At one point, he breaks Essen's hand as a young girl just to teach her to not lash out when she's in pain, which is a really harsh lesson. He softens a bit with Nassen, and Nassen views Shafa as this very strong father figure and sort of a substitute for Gigi, who betrays her. And Nassen is enamored with Shafa, and Shafa decides to sort of fight against his training, and then also this like artifact that's embedded in him that causes him pain if he helps Nassen in the way that he does. He sort of like just lives his life in pain to help her, and then eventually gets on board with her mission to destroy the world, and helps her get to this place called Core Point, which is a city on the other side of the world, where they're going to harness the powers of orogeny to, I think, pull the moon into the planet. Is I didn't quite follow exactly what Nassen's plan was, but I think that was ultimately the plan. It was something with the moon, and I read the Wikipedia plot summary after I finished the book just to like fill in some gaps, and it seems like her plan was to destroy the planet pulling the moon back from its. The moon has been gone for a while, but it's been kind of pulled back into orbit, and the moon being gone is part of what's causing this fifth season and this string of catastrophes and everything. And she wants to just pull the moon back and smash it into the planet and kill everything. That is sort of my impression of like what her big plan is. Using a power called the Obelisk Gate, which there are these obelisks scattered around the world, and if you harness, they have a huge energy potential, and Orogenes can harness the power of these obelisks to like pull an object into the planet. So anyway, Nassen is this tragic figure. She's so sad to read. Shafa is this very complicated mentor figure who is at times villain, at times protector, at times guardian, at times scoundrel. Very, very interesting, well fleshed out character. And then Alabaster is another character who is gone by the third book because he turns into stone. He's slowly turning into stone. Because he'd like reached to the wrong powers or something like that. I don't remember. I'm not super clear what causes people to turn into stone in this book, but there's something about the science that like if you do it wrong, you can turn into a stone person and a statue. And Alabaster is Essen's lover at various times. She was actually assigned when she was still a guardian to like be his partner and like try to like conceive his child, which by direction of the Guardians, which was a really weird, bizarre arc. And they have a very complicated relationship because like they hate each other at first, but then they sort of fall in love and they become like actual, like partners. But he's also a mentor figure to her. He's teaching her how to harness the powers of orogeny to do bigger, better things. And he teaches her about the moon and that the moon was gone and that is coming, like she can bring it back and like maybe reset the seasons. Like her goal is ultimately the opposite of her daughter's goal, which is to bring the moon back and reset the earth so that they don't have these like horrible apocalyptic level events. And Alabaster is a really like snarky, obnoxious character who's fun to read. Another, again, like I keep using this word, another very tragic character. This is a very tragic story. And just a good foil for Essen throughout her chapters in the first couple books. Then there's Hoa, who is a stone eater, and he's the one telling the story. And he's like 40,000 years old and helped cause the apocalyptic event that sent the moon away and created the first they call it the Shattering, the first big apocalypse that led to this like 40,000 years of nonstop recurring catastrophes. And Hoa is a really tragic character too. They're all tragic characters. Hoa was created to emulate, and I'm very unclear on how this works. This all happens in the third book in flashback chapters that I had a little bit of trouble following. But basically, he was one of these creations that were created to help harness the energy of this like advanced civilization that was like harnessing both orogeny and magic to run, and the power of the earth's core to like run their society with like a essentially limitless free energy. But they were like sort of exploiting Hoa and his cohorts in doing this. And then they were also modeled after a group of people who had been basically exterminated by the primary society. And because these people have been exterminated by the primary society, eventually Hoa and his friends sort of figure out that they're being used and that they're being exploited and that they have this dark history with the people that they're based off of. And they get really mad and they decide that instead of doing what they're supposed to do, they're going to destroy Core Point, I think is what it's still called at the time. They're going to just... No, sorry, it's got a different... They're in a different city whose name I'm forgetting. But they're going to destroy the city rather than go along with this scheme. And they do, but they like overshoot and end up like ruining the whole world. And then Hoa turns into a stone eater, which is these creatures that like walk around and eat stones and are like virtually immortal. And he lasts until the present day of the story and becomes friends with Essen, or I don't know if friends is the right word, compatriots with Essen. And at first you're like, oh, this is just this like child figure, and then eventually you find out it's tens of thousands of years old and caused the apocalypse in the first place. Very interesting character. And yeah, so those are the main characters of the story. There's a bunch of other side characters who are worth talking about, but this video is getting pretty long as it is, so I don't want to dive into every single character in the series. But those are sort of the main characters that you follow, and I find them all very, very well fleshed out, very interesting characters that bounce off of each other in interesting ways, serve as foils to each other. One thing that's cool about this book is there's no clear antagonist. There's not like a dark lord that people are fighting like you might see in a traditional fantasy setting. A lot of the conflict comes from these characters who we're sort of following, individually, bouncing off each other. And then, of course, the general conflict against the backdrop of the world being in this disastrous state. But then some of the people involved that we're rooting for and that we care for are causing the world to be in a disastrous state. Be it Hoa or the plans of Nassan going forward. This all comes together in this like great climactic sequence where Essen and Nassan both reach Core Point at the same time. Shafa's unconscious because the Earth has like caused him to be like unconscious and dying by taking the crystal out of his head. It's a little weird. I didn't quite follow that. But the end result is like Nassan's even more upset because Shafa is dying and wants to destroy the planet. And Essen tries to stop her, and they get into this big orogeny battle, and like they're pretty evenly matched, but Essen realizes that she can't stop her daughter, but that her daughter's plan has sort of evolved to involve turning everybody into stone eaters in order to save Shafa. And Essen realizes that like with her options are to just try to destroy her daughter, which she doesn't want to do, or let her daughter's plan succeed. So Essen gives up and turns to stone, it like basically loses the fight and is turned into stone. And her daughter is so moved by her mother's sacrifice that she decides not to destroy the world after all and to implement her mother's plan to bring the moon back into orbit. And Essen is then reborn at the end of the book, and that's when you find out that Hoa is telling her life story back to her to sort of like teach her again. So the climax is brilliant. It's beautiful. It's about like love and sacrifice and forgiveness and processing trauma and all this stuff. Like and with these magical forces and like the question of whether the moon is going to return to orbit or crash into the Earth and kill everybody, or if we're going to turn everybody on the planet into stone eaters. We're like immortal beings that can't live or die. There's just so much going on. It's a great, great finale to the series. It's just everything kind of comes crashing together all at once, and it's really, really good. So that's sort of my reflections on the main arcs, the character arcs, and the final showdown. Let's talk about some of the we're gonna get into a little bit of criticism for a second. My one thing that keeps this series from being like at the absolute pinnacle of my favorite fantasy sci-fi series is that I found some elements of the hard science fiction and hard fantasy a little hard to follow. What people might call the magic system. The relationship between orogeny and magic was really confusing to me. I didn't really understand what magic was doing in this world. They just kept it kept coming up, especially in the third book. We're like, oh yeah, this part's magic, it's not orogeny. This part's orogeny, it's not magic. I wasn't clear what the distinction was or why we needed magic layered on top of orogeny. I'm sure it makes sense. I just didn't follow it, and that at times made it a little hard to follow. The science in general was hard to follow, and some of the plots were hard to follow because of the science. I particularly found the flashback sequences a little difficult to grasp what was going on in those sequences. I think a reread would be really useful for that. The flashbacks being the flashbacks to Hoa's youth when he caused the original apocalypse. I really do think this series would benefit from a reread. And I also never fully followed Nassen's plan to destroy the world, or what the relationship of the Stone Eaters were to everybody else, or how they could use orogeny to turn the whole planet into Stone Eaters. Like, a lot of that stuff was like very wishy-washy to me, but it felt like hard science. It felt like there was a hard system of both science and fantasy and magic in place. I just didn't ever understand how it worked. And that was a little bit of a weakness of the book. It probably is a combination of weakness of my reading comprehension, because this is a very complicated book, and sometimes I miss stuff. I'm a pretty good reader, but sometimes I miss stuff. The way I read this like very staggered. I read the first book a long time ago, and then years ago, and then I read half of the second book, and then I got distracted, and I finished the second half of the second book this year, and then I took like a 6-month break, and then I read the third book. So some of these threads may actually connect very clearly if you read the 3 books back to back to back. Me trying to read them in this like staggered fashion with lots of other books in between, I think I just lost some of the threads. And some books get criticized because they do too much recapping at the beginning of each new book. This book just like assumes you remember the previous books just fine and just throws you back in the deep end. Like both approaches have their merits and their dismerits. I tend to prefer being thrown back in the deep end, but when you read it the way I read it, where there's like these year-long gaps between books, you can lose some threads when it's written that way. So that's sort of my take on like the sci-fi fantasy elements. I do think it's really interesting. I don't know how to classify this, whether it's more of a science fiction book or more of a fantasy book, because it feels like science fiction, but there's these magical elements that's literally called the magic of the world going on as well. And even some of the sci-fi elements feel very magical to me. So it's this weird blend of science fiction and fantasy with a dystopian setting, because we're in these like never-ending natural apocalypses. So it's really interesting blend of genre. And that brings me to the final thing I want to talk about, which is the prose. I loved the writing in this series. Fantasy in particular can oftentimes be pulled down by barely functional prose. Like a lot of the great well-respected fantasy works aren't beautifully written. Like the prose is there to tell the story. It's not there to wow you with its beauty and majesty. This book is well-written fantasy. It's almost written at like a literary fiction level of prose level. It may be, that may be selling it short, and you could probably argue it really is written at a literary fiction level of prose writing. And I think the prose is beautiful in this story. I think the use of second person is so compelling and interesting. I know it turns some people off. Some people can't really get into the second person. I think it's such an interesting choice, and the choice to play with point of view from different perspectives and use point of view to do plot twists, so cool. that twist in the first book where you find out that everybody is the same character is amazing. The twists as it goes on, where you find out that Hoa is the one telling the story the whole time, amazing. Like, using POV to fuel plot twists is a really, really cool thing, and I'm really glad that they went that route. I've already talked about, like, at times the plot is a little hard to follow, which is maybe a downside of, like, a high literary style, but the emotional core of the story is always very clear and very easy to follow, and carried me through even when there were times where I was, like, not following the magic system or the science of it all. And overall, would I recommend this book? I would recommend this book to most people. I know some people struggle with it a little bit. I've definitely heard that there are people who don't love this book, and I get it. I do. It's, if you're not into literary fiction, if you just want, like, sword and shield fantasy, or ships in space sci-fi, this is not the book for you, because this is its own thing. It's not doing classic traditional fantasy or classic traditional sci-fi. It's forging its own path. It's very literary, which turns some people off. So I know this is not a book for everybody. But if you want something that's well written, is challenging, is beautiful, that deals with deep, deep themes essential to the human experience, I can't recommend this series enough. I think this is a great trilogy. It's absolutely worth checking out if you're curious about it. And if you're worried about the second person writing or the literary stylings, I would say still give it a shot. If it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. But, like, this is absolutely earned its hype, and I think it's such a good experience that, like, if you think there's a chance you'll like this book, you owe it to yourself to, or this series, you owe it yourself to give it a shot. So that's my review of the Broken Earth trilogy. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these reviews and want to see more of them, click like and subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.